So I welcome you all to the Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence program, a program sponsored by the Wolf Institute. Of course, we welcome the 2019 Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence, Professor Jose David Saldivar. Can we just put our hands together for him? Our program today is entitled Immigrants of New York City. And I know we do have at least 3 classes here present, classes which are very much centered around immigration and immigrants to North America, and particularly to New York City. Before we begin our program, I would like to, in introducing Professor Saldivar, just tell us a little bit more about him. So, Jose David Saldivar is Leon Sloss Jr. Professor in Comparative Literature and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the CCSRE at Stanford University. He's a scholar of late post-contemporary culture, especially the minoritized literatures of the United States, Latin America, and the Transamerican Hemisphere, and of broader narrative and poetics from the 16th century to the present. Joining the faculty at Stanford in January 2010, Saldivar's previous positions include the class of 1942 Professor of Ethnic Studies and English at the University of California, Berkeley, 1994 to 2010, and faculty in the departments of English and Literature at Duke University, 2007 to 2008. He also currently serves as a faculty director for the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program at Stanford. Of course, Professor Saldivar is an author and editor, and he's the co-editor of 6 scholarly books, including The Dialectics of America, Genealogy, Cultural Critique, and Literary History, 1991, Border Matters, Remapping American Cultural Studies, and of course a book I believe many of the classes today are familiar with, Transamericanity, Subaltern Modernities, Global Coloniality, and the Cultures of Greater Mexico, which was published by Duke University Press in 2012. And today we will very much interrogate this concept of Transamericanity. And in particular, we very much want to see how this concept can allow us to understand the immigration and the immigrant experience to New York City. Of course, immigration as a personal experience, a social experience, a political experience. Good? So before we begin, and I know, again, there are 3 classes present. Professor Daniel Campos's class, the Macaulay Seminar, People of New York City, also Puerto Rican and Latino Studies 3320 class, Latinx Remaking the U.S., and also my class, the Caribbeanization of North America. So before we begin, I would like to ask Professor Saldivar if he could very much explain to us this concept. What is Transamericanity?
Okay.
How does this concept, how can this allow us to very much begin to understand immigration to the U.S.?
Happy. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and for reading some of my work, and for my sponsors to the Robert Hess Scholar in Residence. It's a great honor. I flew all day yesterday from the West Coast to New York. It's always famous, one of my favorite cities, but I'm still a little bit kind of discombobulated. I just finished teaching this on Friday. My last class is at Stanford, and I taught 2 courses. One was a graduate seminar on the U.S.-Mexico border and tearing down the wall. And I'll be talking about kind of border literature and border thinking on Thursday. And the other course was a graduate seminar for a program called Modern Thought and Literature. It's an interdisciplinary program, but it's basically a course that looks at everything that came after modernity in terms of the Enlightenment thinking. So it's various writers that I read, creative writers, imaginative writers, and philosophers. And so I'm happy to be here. I guess before I get to Americanity and Transamericanity, I could just say a little bit about my work. I did my undergraduate work at Yale, and I was an English and literature major, and I was happy to have the mentoring to write an honors thesis in English and literature on 2 writers that at first didn't seem to have much to say to each other. And that was William Faulkner, the writer from the South who won the Nobel Prize, and Jorge Luis Borges from Argentina, the writer of Ficciones, master detective writer, story writer, and just kind of short story writer. But Borges was also a translator. And so he was one of the first Latin American writers to translate William Faulkner into Spanish. And he translated probably one of Faulkner's least well-known novels called The Wild Palms, Las Palmas Salvajes. And this was in around the 40s that he did this. And so he introduced to Latin America and the Caribbean, William Faulkner, who was writing about a space of the South, the Old South, Mississippi. He invented a county called Yacapathna County. And he talked about what created the doom of the South. And it wasn't just the Civil War that created because the South lost the war, but it was the doom of U.S. slavery. And that's what he wrote his works about. So Borges introduced into the Latin American imaginary a whole new way of thinking about the South, about relations of race, about slavery, about creating a piece of land that was yours. And you could see why a writer like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a young writer from Colombia, would be so fascinated by this U.S. writer who was writing in his novels a history of Mississippi and the South. And so soon Garcia Marquez was fascinated by the idea of creating his own county or his own territory in Colombia that turned out to be Macondo, the history of Latin America. So I was asking a question as an undergraduate that I didn't really fully understand, would kind of, jumpstart my career, so to speak. So in my honors thesis, I was interested in how were Latin American writers and Latinx writers reading America? What was their conception of America? And in this case, it was a very particular America by William Faulkner, a Nobel Prize winner, as I mentioned, but who was writing about the U.S. South and the history of the doom of the South. That was a term he used. What created the doom of the South was U.S. slavery. And so these were things that I started to think about. And I went then from Yale to Stanford. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to write my dissertation on. But I had good mentoring. I worked with a Chicano scholar, Arturo Islas, from the border area of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And so Professor Islas asked me to start thinking about the U.S.-Mexico border as a particular space. What was being written by Chicano and Chicana and Latinx writers about the U.S.-Mexico border, and what were Mexican writers writing about the border? Since we had, in some cases, a similar river. I mean, I grew up in South Texas, and I grew up right next to the Rio Grande. But on the other side of the border, it was called the Rio Bravo. So what, this kind of clash of how we name things, how we understand geography, how we understand regions, I started to think about. But for my dissertation, I asked a simple question, which is, do the Americas have a common literature? So that was my kind of research question. Maybe now in hindsight, that is my research question. Maybe I didn't have that when I was a graduate student. But it turned out that really came out of my honors thesis at Yale. So I would say for those of you who had an opportunity to write an honors thesis, it can go a long way. You don't know what that work's going to do with you. And in fact, I didn't know that it would kind of impel my work. So from that simple question, do the Americas have a common literature? I spent time in the archives at Stanford at a kind of a right-wing think tank called the Hoover Institution. And I did that because they studied communism. They studied the history of the Soviet Union and communism. So all the archives I was interested in about the Caribbean, Cuba, Mexico, I was doing all of my research in the Hoover. So I think to answer that question, do the Americas have a common literature? Of course, my answer was yes, but I was struck by why hadn't people written about that? Remember, this is the 1990s, so it's a long time ago. No one had, I thought, in my field taken that question up. And I was surprised because I did know that historians had asked that question. The U.S. historians had asked, do the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean have a common history? And they answered yes. The history of the New World, the history of the discovery, the history of the colonization of the New World is something that is shared by the Caribbean and Latin America and the United States. So I felt like, well, why hadn't literary scholars taken up that question? And how could I begin to think about what is it that they have in common? They have certain common themes, the New World, the history of the doom of the New World. Junot Diaz calls that the Fuku Americanus and the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, that there's something very, tragic about the encounter between Europe and the New World. And so I felt I was onto something in my research, but I was like lost in the wilderness. Nobody thought what I was doing made any sense. When I would talk to my colleagues in the English department, they really didn't know who my colleagues were in Latin American Studies or the Caribbean. They didn't see any connection. And it took a while to publish essays in the field and to publish my first book called The Dialectics of America, where I answered that question. And I had a literary response, like of influence. Borges wrote on Faulkner. Faulkner influenced Borges and Garcia Marquez and the boom writers. But when I was doing my postdoc, I'll make my story shorter, I had historians and social scientists say, well, that doesn't mean anything, Jose. Influence, what is that? What is intertextuality? They didn't have a sense of how writers read each other. They wanted some empirical evidence or some kind of institutional evidence to support my thesis. And I think the best feedback I got were from historians at Stanford who asked me, can't you find some institutional apparatus that would allow you to say something about how the writers from Latin America, the Caribbean, the United States actually come together institutionally? And I said, I have the answer because I'd been studying it. I just had never thought of it. Every year since 1959, after the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban publisher, the Casa de las Americas, had a given award every year in poetry, in ensayo, essay, in the novel, in testimony. And every year they award writers from across the Americas. So I now had an institutional history to say that if we wanted to think about what they have in common, we can think about what's been published through Havana, Cuba. And so Cuba became the cultural center of my world. It was the cultural capital of the Caribbean, of Latin America, of the US-Mexico border, and the United States. That's what I argued in my first book. So this led me to, in my subsequent work, to understanding, what is Americanity, first of all? And Americanity was written by two historical sociologists, Emanuel Wallerstein, who was teaching at the time at Binghamton. He now teaches at Yale. And he's a world system historian for the social scientists who know his work. And he co-wrote an essay with his colleague from Lima, Peru, another historical sociologist named Aníbal Quijano. And again, it was interesting that Quijano, writing from Lima, Peru, the global south, Wallerstein writing from New York, the global north, wrote an essay together to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America. So they wrote an essay called Americanity, and they didn't use the word America. I thought that was interesting. Or why this Americanity? And what they were suggesting that with the discovery of the New World, a whole cultural, philosophical, sociological, historical apparatus came together in what they called the Americanity. So Americanity is the whole history, formation, the systems of control that the Europeans, Spaniards in particular, used to control race and ethnicity in the New World. So in a kind of my longer answer, Americanity is a concept, a structure by two historical sociologists who are trying to understand, what has been the history of the New World post-1492? And what were the structures, what they called the matrix, the coloniality matrix of power that were used to control labor, gender formations, historical formations, and they would even say cultural literary formations. So it was a whole apparatus that allowed me to think about all of these things historically. I'll say more of this, I guess, maybe answering questions.
So how did the concept of Americanity then cause you to think about Transamericanity?
Right. Well, it did. I mean, when I was writing my last book that I wrote, it took me a long time. I mean, books sometimes I'm a slow writer. My first book was coming out of my PhD dissertation, took me 8 years. And I said, oh my God, that's too slow because your tenure clock is running and you need to write a book in maybe 6-7 years. So I was like, oh my God, that's not going to be good if it takes me 8 to 10 years to write every book. So I barely got tenure because I met the deadline. And then I said, I'm not going to do that again. And luckily I had a postdoc. It took me 2 years to write my second book on the U.S.-Mexico border. I said, well, that's fantastic. That's not so hard. And I got promoted to full professor at a young age. I thought, wow, I chose the right field, right discipline. But then I became chair of my department of ethnic studies at Berkeley, and I was in English. It was a difficult time. You know, Berkeley is historically can be a little bit rancorous. Colleagues sometimes argue with each other. And I was chair. I was trying to manage that. It took me 10 years to write my third book called Transamerica. But, I just reread it recently. I don't like to read or teach my books because, what would I have to say? Read my books. But it was recently translated to Spanish. So in 2018, the Casas Americas in Cuba was a great honor for me. They published that book in Spanish in Havana, Cuba, and it was co-published by a center in Santiago, Chile. And it was translated as Transamericanidad. So it just came out in December. I got to Chile, I went. But it forced me to read my book in Spanish. My translator is fantastic. And it made me sound much smarter. So I hope she'll translate all my books. But it gave me a certain distance from my own work to read it in another language and to grapple with why Transamericanity. Well, I felt that I couldn't use the term Americanity, Americanidad, because that term belonged to Quijano and Wallerstein.
Yes.
So I think it's a good question because in reading the book again, what does the trans add to a concept that is already global? Their notion of Americanity is not only about what the history and cultures and literatures of the America have in common, it's really what the world has in common in producing power from their understanding of this. So I guess if I had to do it over again, maybe the trans I would have maybe put it in a hyphen or something or in a parentheses, but my editor would have not liked that. So the trans I was just trying to make a distinction between a term that had been used and known in the social sciences, Americanity. I was trying to translate that term into a different discipline called the humanities and cultural studies. So I felt that I could add, the only way to distinguish my conception, building on the work of Quijano and Wallerstein, was to add the trans. So it's a little bit redundant now. I mean, the book is now 10 years old. Oh my God. Almost 10 years old. 6, is it? What year? 7. Feels like 10. So the trans I was trying to say something that, what is it across the Americas that allows me to bring a whole different set of writers together and thinkers? And so that's, in a nutshell, the trans part. But I don't think I've added anything to what the historical sociologists Emmanuel Wallerstein and Anibal Quijano already were getting at. And Quijano just passed away in December, so I fortunately did have the chance to thank him for his work. And he did know that I'd written this book called Transamericanity, and he took it very graciously.
That's quite an excellent story.
I have a lot of stories.
Yeah, I love it. So I'm not sure many of us are familiar with Professor Saldivar's last book, the book to which we're referring, Transamericanity, Subaltern Modernities, Global Coloniality, and the Cultures of Greater Mexico. But I know at least one class here, Professor Daniel Campos' class, people of New York City. I know that you all have read parts of this book, and I know that you all have come prepared with questions. I also want to say that Professor Campos really wanted to be here today.
Okay.
He was really excited to meet with you, but could not be here. Him and I actually met last week to discuss your book. And I think the main question was, what is Transamericanity? Is it a political idea? Right. Is it sort of like literary criticism? Right. Is it sort of this utopian idea with regard to how to view the Americas and people of the Americas? Right. And I know that students from this class, plus other students, right, because I know there are multiple classes here, you do have questions, right? What is this concept? How does this concept very much allow us to understand ourselves as persons in the Americas? And I include myself. You can hear accent. I am an immigrant from Trinidad, right, from the Caribbean. My name is Aleah Ranjitsingh. I did not introduce myself at the very beginning. Teaching a class called Caribbeanization of North America here, where we look at how Caribbeans migrate to North America and are able to transform spaces So, I think the main question is, how does this concept allow us to understand the Americas and persons from the Americas coming into the North American space?
Right.
And is it a utopian political idea?
Right.
Is it literary criticism?
Right.
And I do want to open up the floor for questions, particularly those who are coming from Professor Campos's class with questions prepared. I know you all have questions prepared, he did tell me. And also other questions, other students with questions, because I know there are multiple classes represented here. So your questions, right, on Transamericanity, right? You have the author here, the scholar, he's here. So take full advantage of it. Questions? I know you all have questions. Professor Campos assured me that there were questions. Yes?
My question is, do you think that there is a culture that's like specifically American, or has American culture just become something that's like just too worldly to be its own, and it's just pulled from everywhere?
Right. I think that's a great question, because it very much is things that I've been thinking about now for maybe 30 years, and that is, when we think of America, we think about the United States of America, but we forget that we're something called Latin America, or other, maybe an American hemisphere. And that's what I was trying to think about, more than just the United States. Obviously, I'm an Americanist by training. What that means is you study the culture, the history, and the literature of the United States. But I was interested in something bigger. And I was, as I said, trying to understand, is there anything in common about the United States, our history, our culture, our literary imaginations, with the Caribbean and Latin America? It's a very broad question, and that's only something that I think a historical sociologist, a social scientist think big. They like big questions like that, it seems to me, and that's something that I'm trying to learn from my colleagues in the social sciences, who think about the world, they think about globalization. They think, when I'm in Europe, whether I'm in Berlin or Paris or Madrid, the first thing I see are the movies, and they're all, American movies. It's all the Terminator, at least it was when I was in Spain, the Terminator everywhere. It's Black Panther now, everywhere I go. So what is it about the way that popular culture circulates globally? And in Europe, I'm often told that what I think I mean by globalization, they want to correct me. It's not just globalization. It's Americanization of the world. It's the Americanization of America, if that's a little bit redundant. So I do think there is something central to how we think about not only the Americas, Latin America, the Caribbean, and that would include Canada, obviously, because it's part of North America. There's now whole ways that we think about studying American studies. There's something called hemispheric American studies. Sometimes I've given too much credit for that term, because I really am just a really small piece of that. There's many more of my colleagues writing on that. So the question was, do I think there is something, well, what is it that's common?
No, just is there a specific culture that's American?
Right, it would be, if there is a specific culture that's American, has a long, complicated history that begins in 1492 with the coming of the Columbus, the admiral, to the New World, and then with subsequent colonization of the New World by the Spanish, the British, the French, the Dutch. That creation would be American for me. That's what I'm trying to understand better. So it's a historical conceptualization that I have. For example, before the Europeans and the Spanish came to the New World, there was no terms called negro or black. That didn't exist in the New World. There was no term called mulatto, mulata mixed, or mestizo, mestiza mixed, or Creole, Creolite. These are all terms that came from Europe to define the inhabitants, the peoples of the New World. And I find that to be an important thing to keep in mind. So in a way, I'm trying to recover, what is it that we called ourselves before the conquest and the colonization of the Americas? Well, I would have to learn Quechua and learn something about the Huantansuyo in the Andes. They didn't call themselves these terms, where I would have to learn Nahuatl and learn something about how Anuak or Tenochtitlan imagined themselves, and they had histories, they had books, hieroglyphs, they have records. I had to kind of re-educate myself in a way. I mean, I still haven't learned Nahuatl or Quechua, but it's something that's a long, we live a long time hopefully,
Yeah.
and I can learn lots of languages.
Yeah, definitely. So what you're saying is that the question about, a common American culture is one that is based on coloniality.
On coloniality,
one
right.
That's based on racism.
Right, right.
Ethnic constructs.
Ethnic constructs, and that these were not just terms that were willy-nilly brought, but there was a way of categorizing who's human and who isn't.
Right.
Who counts to be a human and who isn't. So if they were to ask the question to the people of, let's say, the Andes, in Tenahuantinsuyo, ain't I a woman? They would say no, because of the way that they were treated through colonialism, not as human beings, but as lesser than humans.
Yes.
So that history is a complicated one that I'm trying to understand. With not just, one has to kind of read widely. So I'm reading literary critics, I'm reading historians, I'm reading cultural folks, I'm reading philosophers. And because I'm trained as a literature person, what I know is philology, the history of how words mean. In a way, I'm a philologist. I mean, I tell my students, and they try to say, well, what is that? I say, well, people who look at words and how they travel, how they move. So and usually in the history of our academic vocabulary, the history is that the terms appeared first in Greek, and then were translated into Latin. So the term human was first anthropos from the Greeks. It then became, through European colonization, what it meant to be human. But people of color, Indians, indigenous peoples, were not considered human. So I think that history I see in the literature being represented. So I just try to pay attention to how these words travel. And now, as a professor, I'm trying to say, well, how can we change the discourse? How could I then even enter that debate? If historically the Europeans brought a system of classifying people racially, ethnically, sexually, and we didn't count in those terms, or let's say some of us, how do we recover that? It's not an easy process. I don't have an answer.
Questions? Yes.
My question really was you were talking about Americanity, and you were talking about
Transamericanity, right?
Transamericanity, and my question was that what made you to really write this book? What were you? I remember you were talking about what you were focusing on, how you started, or what is your main reason? What is it that made you to get that attention? Where are you going to that you want to send? You're trying to send a message to the people, all the immigrants out there that about the Latin American culture, just culture of global culture.
Global culture.
So what is your message that you're trying to send to the people writing the book?
Right. And again, because it took me 10 years to write, I mean, I was doing other things too. You teach, and I was teaching at a public university, Berkeley. I had good class system, 100 students. I mean, for 10 years, you do a lot of work. I was also continuing my archival work. I was also sharing an apartment. I'd say all those things take time. But I think the most difficult part was I was trying to master other disciplines. I mean, I'm trained in literature. I'm trained as a comparatist. But luckily, I was also working with sociologists. I had to learn a whole new method and discourse, like Americanity. That term comes from the social sciences. It's not a literary term. That's what we study in the humanities. So the message I was trying to get across was that we have to study widely. We have to read sociology, historical sociology. In my case, I was working with a sociologist that I had hired at Berkeley, Ramon Gross-Rugel, who was a student of Emmanuel Wallerstein and Quijano, and helped me open up to questions in sociology and history. But I was also working with a philosopher, Nelson Maldonado Torres, who is a Puerto Rican philosopher, and introduced me to the philosophical thinking of the Caribbean, Frantz Fanon, Césaire, with Mexico, Enrique Dussel, Latin America. And so it took me 10 years just to feel confident that I could say something intelligently about the Americas. So my understanding, so my message is, there isn't one America called the United States. It's something broader and richer, and that we can all, as immigrants, think about. I mean, in my case, you know, I go back 7 generations to South Texas, como Tejano, but it means that before there was Texas, there was something called Nuevo Santander, New Spain, that colonized my area. So at least I was sensitive to, at least generationally, my family going through many different formations of who we are. So I was trying to, I mean, to answer your question very straightforwardly, I was trying to get the message across that there is a richer, greater American world out there, and it's hemispheric initially. It includes Canada, includes the Caribbean, includes Latin America, and my own area, the U.S.-Mexico border. So that's the only thing. And I think, you know, I also realize that academic books, you know, one doesn't know what's going to be the impact of your work. I mean, I can't predict that. But I'm hoping that in the future, it'll enrich how we study what it means to be American.
My question was, do you believe that Transamericanity affects the efficacy of social surveys such as censuses, given that they account for how people identify their nationality, but not to the level to which they are tied to their country of origin?
Right. No, that's a great question. I mean, that's a question I wish I had a better answer to, because I don't study, you know, kind of how we name ourselves or how the census names ourselves. I do know there is a debate right now in the United States about whether we should even be asked that on a census. And I know that the Trump administration is being sued by folks saying that they have no business doing that. Now, but I do understand that there's a history of how the census classifies us. So, I mean, I guess when if I can be a little bit truthful, I always put other. And then I put my own. But I know it doesn't mean anything. So it's just a small little protest. Just like for many years in California, I voted every year, every election for Angela Davis. I wrote her name in the president. Well, I mean, I told Professor Angela Davis this because I got a chance to teach with her when I was at Santa Cruz, and she thought that was fine, but I was throwing my vote away. So she said, you know, vote for the most, you know, appropriate candidate, and I have. I voted for President Obama. So good things. I'm probably going to vote for the first Chicano running for president, you know, Julian Castro. So I'm going to vote for him. Maybe. I haven't decided. There's a lot of good, I mean, we'll see who, if he makes it. Kamala Harris, and my senator from California is right on, so we'll see.
John packed race.
John, yes, and we have a lot of good, I mean, I just want to change the administration, the current one. So yes, I think it would affect how we think of these categories of self-identification. I doubt that there'll ever be a category called Americanity. I don't know. And that can be utopian, maybe.
How do you think your new definition of what Americanity would be affects the way we see immigration today?
Well, that's
Immigration/migration.
right. You know, those are all good questions, you know, outside of my field, but because I know colleagues who I work with who are sociologists at Berkeley and at Stanford, I don't know. I don't know how it would affect it, but it would give us more knowledge of how these terms travel. You know, I do know that, for example, in the Caribbean, how do we think about Florida? I mean, what is the capital? Is Miami the capital of the Caribbean and Latin America? I've had my sociologist friends argue that it is. And there's reasons historically and geopolitically why it may be. Now that's, you know, coming from California, it seems like, I don't know how that would affect how we think about it, but some would say within the world system, there is some truth. You know, like, and I was trying to make a polemical point in my book. The capital of Americanity is Havana, Cuba, the cultural capital. Well, that, you know, my colleagues were like, you know, were like wanting to be really surprised by my argument. I mean, I wasn't just trying to be polemical. I was trying to say, well, in this post-history of the Cuban Revolution, it's had an impact in bringing writers and scholars and activists from around the Americas together. I mean, they have a contest every year I was actually, after I wrote my first book on this prize, I was then asked by the president of the Las Americas, Professor Roberto Fernandez Retamar, who is a Cuban Marxist, but also a professor of literature, to be on their selection committee to give a prize to the first Latinx writer of the Americas. And I think that was institutionally important because that category didn't exist until they decided it was important to exist. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered it, but I do think it helps us rethink space, geography, time, in ways that I was not taught myself.
So I think the question is it a real political identity? If there is a common American culture,
right.
one that's very much based on a common history of coloniality, of
Right.
racism, of these ethnic constructs, I mean, it makes us rethink who, as you said, who is American. So it
Right.
means I'm American, you
Right.
know, I'm Trinidadian, of course.
Right.
But given the concept of Americanity and Transamericanity, it
Right.
makes us rethink who is
Who is-
American in
right.
terms of an identity. So
Right.
is this a real political
Well,
identity?
I don't. I
Is
think
it-
it's a, you know, since I see myself more as a, I don't see myself as an activist professor
Yeah.
by any regard, but I do see that this work has impact
Mhm.
on ideas.
Mhm.
You know, when I get invited to Santiago, Chile, or I get invited to Cuba, or I get invited just recently to teach at the University of Berlin, they read your work.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are saying, well, this is, you know, we don't have anybody saying this in Europe. We don't have anybody saying this in,
Mhm.
at least in Chile, you know. So I didn't imagine at the time that I'm writing my work that I would, you know, one can't think that way. I mean, I can't think that my impact's not going to have more than what I'm hoping will be a very local impact
Mhm.
on my scholarship, on how I teach to my students. And it's hard for me to think bigger because if I had bigger ideas, I think I would be very paralyzed. Like your work does travel.
Mhm. There's a
But
question in
I
the
do
back.
think it has some political efficacy.
Sorry to cut
Yeah,
you.
no.
There's a question in the back first, and I'm going to come to the front.
Yeah, you mentioned that like a shared history of being colonized is an element of Transamericanity and
Right.
Americanity. Do other countries that have been colonized, like India and South America, do they also have like elements of Transamericanity in them, or it's
Yeah.
specific to the hemisphere?
That's a good question because at the time I was only thinking about the hemisphere. But when I've traveled more and studied more, I mean, I do know that there's something called globalization. I do know we live in a period of, some would say we passed modernity. And so the question is, what comes after modernity? And we do know from the Quijano and Wallerstein that the modernity was just one side of the coin. The other side was coloniality, all of the doom of the New World, the racism, the rape of indigenous peoples and people of color, slavery, the Middle Passage, diaspora. That's the other side of modernity, according to the historical sociologists I'm working with. I would want to think, say in the case of India, they have their own answer, that they were colonized much later than 1492 by the British. So I think there would be some question about, well, what is that history between the British Empire and Asia, South Asia in particular? But they have their own philosophers and thinkers and critics and artists, and they answer it that they're post-colonial. They're post-colonials. It's a little bit different than being post-colonial and not thinking you ever had a post,
Yeah.
which is what coloniality
Mhm.
suggests, that
Yeah.
after all of the wars of independence in Latin America, colonization formally ended, but the logic of colonization remained through coloniality.
Mhm.
But the British are now, I mean, the South Asians are thinking about this question, I think. So I wouldn't say it's all American, because we'd have to be very careful about, well, who colonized whom and what is that history? Yeah.
Okay, so I noticed that Transamerican was published in 2012,
Right.
just a bit ago.
Right.
However, I was just kind of curious to see like how the concepts that you discussed within that book, like if they change with the changing political climates of the United States or even like of the Americas in general, like if they did and if
Right.
they didn't, like
Right.
how so.
Right. Yeah. As I said, the book was just translated to Spanish in 2018. So that in itself is a transformation, because no longer am I just being read by those who read in English, but now people in places where I never had imagined they had an interest. Why would Chile be interested, or Chilean kind of academic culture? It's because they have their own history of colonization. They have their own history of coloniality. They had a history of a dictatorship called Pinochet that was kind of funded by the United States and the CIA. So they're interested, how are they grappling with their own national imaginary about race, ethnicity, and gender? They have indigenous peoples in Chile called the Mapuche. So they're trying to think about how Americanity functions locally. So I guess that's all interesting to me, because, I know that theories, ideas don't remain put or static, they travel all over the world. In terms of my own thinking, as I said, I think I would have been more careful with the trans part, because I think it's a little bit redundant to take a global concept that's already global. And maybe I should have just left it that. So I do think that terms do change. And I was able to, in the Cuban edition and Chilean edition, the book ends with an interview, and the translator interviewer, her name is Professor Monica Gonzalez Garcia, and she teaches in Chile, they were asked by the Cubans if I could bring up my thinking up to date. So I tried to, and I talked about new terms, new ways of thinking. And I'll say more a bit on Thursday, I guess.
Questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Professor Robles. My group is here.
Yeah, great.
Today.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts on all these important topics. Next week we're going to start discussing the fight for Mexican American studies in Arizona, right? And the advocacy of the people, the students, teachers of Mexican American studies. And I wanted to know your take on that issue. Yeah,
right.
And why do you think there was so much resistance from the government and the political elite against Mexican American studies?
Right. No, I mean, it was given that we're celebrating, at least in California, in Berkeley, where I taught for many years, the 50th anniversary of the founding of ethnic studies, of African American studies, of Native American, Asian American, in particular Chicano studies was very much part of that at Berkeley and in California and at San Francisco State. Many of the activists are still very much alive. They were actually calling for something pretty radical too, not just the creation of these departments. They wanted a whole college. You know how we're broken into the colleges of what? Social science, College of Humanities, business, computer science. I teach at Stanford. They own Stanford Computer Science. So they were calling for the creation of a third world college 50 years ago. And my students who are activists still are calling for that. I don't even know what that would look like. It would just be another college that would have more power than local departments. When you're a local department, you have chairs, you have faculty, but you always report to a dean. Well, they wanted a dean of third world college. So I still think it's as we say in California, far out people know the way out. It's a far out idea. So to get to your question, I do, since I don't know the local situation in Arizona other than what I read, but my sense is that Arizona is one of the more reactionary states of the Southwest, even though it has a large indigenous population and a large Mexican, American, Chicano, probably immigrant community from Central America, other parts of the Americas. But we have very little power. So institutionally, we had very little power. We could name our own department. But my sense is that really was they started a program in high schools to teach Mexican American studies in high schools. And that became a debate about public education in the state. And there we did have power. In California, where we have our power is in our elected representatives, who are primarily now African American, Chicano, Mexican American. Our Attorney General is a Chicano from Stanford, and he is fighting Trump every day, suing Trump as much as he can. One is taking the lead. I'm not saying California's all taking the lead, but they have the population and to name this. So I think California is taking the lead from Arizona, to saying that Mexican-American studies, Chicano studies should be a requirement for high school students. And that's going to be a political question in the legislature. Well, and educational, to be sure. But I think it's a question of power. So I think why Arizona got so much news is because we sensed the shifting terrain of legislative power in the state. Because if Arizona can have this past all of the other states with heavy populations of immigrants or ethnic minorities, will follow suit. I mean, I think Texas is going to happen. It's going to happen in Texas. It's going to happen in Colorado. I think New York is ripe for this kind. I don't know what the requirements are in New York City. Don't you think there would be useful to have ethnic studies requirements for all high school students in the state of New York? I think you guys have the power too, right? Don't you have the governor? I mean, I think you have senators. This is where the power is. Yeah, so I think those of us who teach in the field, I mean, I wasn't asked to go to court and testify as a specialist, but my colleagues did, and they were very powerful and persuasive. Yeah. The sociologists, the historians, the geographers, I mean, they were fantastic. So it's one thing it's surprising that we do have, as professors, a little bit of knowledge of what we teach, and we could be persuasive. And many of our students are now in the legislature. Like Javier Becerra, the Attorney General, was one of my students at Stanford. He went to law school, of course, but there's power that the generations of what we've been doing for 30, 40 years may have an impact. I don't know if President Obama took ethnic studies at Occidental or Columbia. I think he did. Our current president should. But I don't know if he reads. Put it on TV. Let's have some.
Let's get a question over there.
Hi. Based on, let's say, Jose Marti and
Right.
his work he was a Cuban exile at the time when the U.S. was considering colonizing Cuba, how could the concept of Transamericanity, or rather having a Transamerican identity, play in current issues? Let's say, how can someone who identifies as a Transamerican have an important role in contributing to resolving domestic or international issues?
Right, great question. I mean, it reminds me too, I'm not calling away for our terms. I'm not calling away that I call myself a Chicano. My parents didn't understand what that was because they weren't part of a social movement, and they didn't go to college. I mean, they called themselves very local terms. I'm not for changing how we. I mean, I agree with the anthropologists. The people should decide what to call ourselves, right? But I'm thinking at a larger level, there is something that I'm saying we're all American, Americanidad. It's something that has a longer history, has a lot of depth to it. But one of the people that I wrote my first book on was Jose Marti, and that's why I called my book The Dialectics of Our America. Marti wrote an essay in exile in New York City, which I think interesting, because when I was a student, I was never told that Jose Marti wrote this essay in New York, and that he was affiliated with the Puerto Rican tobacco workers and other Latinx workers in New York City. So I think that's really important that Marti in exile writes this big idea called Our America, which he saw as different from the United States, already taking the lead of what Wallerstein, Quijano were getting at, that there's something more historically bigger that could unify the continent. My one little minor quarrel with Jose Marti, and it's so minor because he was such an important poet, critic, activist, died for his patria in the War of 1898. I teach a course on the War of 1898, and I teach Marti next to Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Riders. We get to see a very different history of that war. My only qualm, and this is with some of my Cuban colleagues and Latin America, why does Latin America end at the U.S.-Mexico border? Why does Nuestra America not include Florida, Mississippi, all of the southern states that are on the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, going to the U.S.-Mexico border to California? That when we were colonized in the 16th century, there was no border. So we share that history with that. And I just told my Cuban interlocutors what they thought was funny, that Martí should have incorporated parts of New York. He was writing in New York. Obviously, he traveled from New York all the way down the path from New York to Florida, where there was communities of Cuban tobacco workers that he was trying to organize to fund the Cuban Revolutionary Party and to fight against Spanish colonialism and then U.S. imperialism. Yeah, so I think that idea is really important in Western America. I mean, it goes hand in hand with already Martí is trying to understand what is it that we have in common or what are our differences. He said there's our America, Nuestra America, which he meant Latin America and the Caribbean, and then there's the America which is not ours. That's what he literally said, which is the United States. So yeah, I think it could, I don't know how Martí would have thought about Americanity. I think he would have understood the history of what Quijano and Wallerstein were getting at.
So, speaking, I want to add on to her question. How does Transamerican, what would you say, how does it affect with U.S. territories, like the Philippines from Puerto
Right.
Rico, how does it, how do you think of that in that sense?
Right.
Because in for example, I'm Dominican and Filipino, and going to the Philippines, I'm one of the only generations that speak Tagalog, and now I'm only speaking English. So how does that affect Transamericanity for those places?
Right.
They
No,
used
that's
to have their own culture,
Right.
and now their culture is slowly assimilating to them.
Assimilated, right. Well, I think you're referring to the same question that Martí was raising, when, he was starting to fight the colonialism, the history of colonialism in Cuba. A war developed where the U.S., fought against not only the Caribbean and Cuba and Puerto Rico, which they wanted to annex, but they also got control of Hawaii and the Philippines in particular. So there's a similar historical trajectory of the Americanization of the world that the War of 1898 already, kind of foretold. And there was a Jose Martí figure in the Philippines, Jose Rizal, who wrote an important book against Spanish colonialism, Noli Me Tangere. I think that's Latin, but he wrote half the book in Spanish, 3/4 of it, and some in Tagalog. The very little that I know, I learned from Jose Rizal. So yeah, I think it's part of a similar historical movement. So why is it that the Philippines, what did they share with the Latin America and the Caribbean? What they shared was Spanish colonialism. So there is something shared. It's too bad that we all share war, the history of war. That's kind of not very optimistic.
Do you feel like it's more the practice of colonialism that defines trans-American
Right.
Americanity, or is it the actual implication of it in certain places?
Right. I think it's the implication, as I said, we had something called colonization. That's a historical process of one empire taking over the peoples of another, changing their culture, how they represent themselves. And it's also a periodization. Coloniality is the logic of that process of control, of social control, of control over resources, over control of who you are, according to Quijano and Wallerstein. So I would say, I try to make a distinction between the process that mostly historians and sociologists study, the colonization part, but the logic is what continues. I think that's what I find very interesting in the work of, Wallerstein and Quijano. So what is that? What is that history? What is that logic? How is it affecting us today? And so that leads me to my third term, what we already talked about, colonial. And for me, let me also spell that out. Americanity, for me, is synonymous with coloniality. Because Wallerstein and Quijano wrote that essay when Quijano was formulating his idea of coloniality, but he didn't use it because, I don't know, because I'm not an expert on world system theory. I rely on my colleagues who are. But as far as I know, Emanuel Wallerstein never used the term coloniality. But Quijano did. So coloniality is a term that was conceptualized in Latin America. So I find that that's going to travel and have much more impact. So I just find, but to me they're synonymous. The process of what I'm trying to analyze and understand, I was following called Americanity. In my latest work, and maybe that's what I'm changing, I'm realizing that it's almost synonymous with what Quijano is arguing in this term coloniality. Now there's debate among not only the Latin Americanists, there's debate among those of us who study this. There is no consensus yet about that. But I think that'll work itself out.
Now, I know you said that you're not an activist professor, but I think Transamericanity is a very radical idea.
Thank you.
Professor Campos, we talked about, is it, even very utopian?
Right. No, and I wanted to respond to that because what I found really interesting at the end of their essay, after they give all this history of doom, of rape, of colonialism, of indigenous and the Middle people being history of genocide in the New World, the history of the Middle Passage, of diaspora, of U.S. slavery. They're writing in 1992, and they say they know they're utopian, but in the face of this dystopia. So, but they're saying they want to redefine utopia to incorporate African American thinking of Africa, and the thinking of indigenous people. So a concept like reciprocity among indigenous peoples, let's say in Tenochtitlan, Mexico, and these people are living today, so I shouldn't just say in Tenochtitlan. In Peru and in Mexico, we have the Zapatistas, we have indigenous folks, activists. They're saying what we can learn today is to what we're learning about reciprocity. What does that mean to have reciprocity culturally, morally, in terms of our government representation? I think it was in Ecuador recently, they rewrote the Constitution, but they included all of the indigenous concepts of their population to go alongside Western notions of a constitution. That's what the Zapatistas were trying to do and are still trying to do in Mexico, to have reciprocity among maybe even politically, among different, peoples.
Yeah.
So yes, I guess it would be utopian,
yeah.
but they're responding to a dystopia. So I don't like to see things as dystopian, although I think I understand, for my students what it means to live in a dystopia.
Definitely. But if we hold on to this ideal or this identity, or maybe it's a practice.
Practice, right?
Then,
I think it's a practice.
It's a practice.
Yeah, and in fact, it's praxis. So, I'm a bit of a, maybe not of a Marxist there, but of a Cuban Marxist, but, this idea of what Antonio Gramsci noted of a praxis. We all are philosophers, he argued. And I think that can be very liberating, that any of us who have walking shoes or we're walking as thinkers, as humans. So I do believe in praxis, in our practice, in our practices of what we do as professors. And as I said, I've been teaching for a while now, and because I've taught at large public universities before I went to Stanford to teach, I don't think about it, but now that I'm getting to, I've directed 40 dissertations over my career, and probably another 100 dissertation committees. I think my students, and they're all doing great work on their own, but it's a praxis. I think that's why we teach. We teach for the next generation. Your teachers are mentoring you, your professors, for what you then can do that we couldn't do in our own, practice. So so I think it's in that case, it's a life-term commitment to changing our educations.
But then I think the larger question is, and one student had brought it up earlier, what does this then mean for the immigrant experience, right?
Right.
In America. And
Right.
by America here, I mean the United
United
States
States,
of America.
right.
Right? If there is this common culture of Americanity,
Right.
you know, what does it talk, you know, sorry, what does it say about, you know, that immigrant experience, this idea of, you know, persons coming from the
Americas, right.
to North America,
Right.
Particularly those who are crossing the border.
Right.
You know, if we very much hold on to this identity or this concept or this praxis, it can transform everything, right?
Right.
Particularly with the way in which we view ourselves. It could very much inform policies, which are
Right.
very much exclusionary. I mean, there are children who are being ripped apart from their parents at the
course.
border.
Right,
But
put
if
in
we hold
cages.
on to this idea
Right.
or this praxis,
Right.
it, you know, it's very much, you know,
Right.
transformational.
Right. No, as I said, I
Yeah.
mean, I never in my lifetime
Mhm.
would I have imagined what we're experiencing today
Mhm.
under the current administration,
Mhm.
where where borders are being re-sealed again, where it's always been militarized. I mean, let's not make a mistake about that. And when President Trump said he's going to build a wall, I think 90% has already been built. I mean, for those of you who go walk along the border, on Thursday I'm going to show a map that I have of the U.S.-Mexico border that comes from Homeland Security.
Mhm.
They've divided up the U.S.-Mexico border into 12 sectors. And we can see where the wall needs to be built. Trump's, what, $4 billion, $9 billion, I don't know how many billions he's asking for, is going to build 500 miles of a 1,950-mile long border. That's what that $9 billion is going to, because that means that the rest is already patrolled. We're undergoing what the Europeans call low-intensity conflict. It's been this way since I was a young boy in South Texas growing up on the border. The Homeland Security after 9/11 has beefed up the Border Patrol. And we see what's happening today on the U.S.-Mexico border when Central American caravans trying to escape Central American violence to come to seek asylum, the children are being ripped apart from their families and literally being put in cages. That's what we have today. I mean, I never in my lifetime would I have imagined. There's no reciprocity there. And one of the painters I'm going to talk about is a Chicano painter from Los Angeles named Ramiro Gomez. And what he does, I'm just saying, because I don't know how many will be coming to my talk, he goes to Best Buy and he gets cardboard and he paints figures of workers, invisible workers, nannies, gardeners, people who clean the pools of all the rich people in California. And he had one, I'd say, of all the people who mow the lawns of the super rich in Beverly Hills, of the workers, and he makes paper cutouts and puts them next to the mansions in Beverly Hills. Well, Obama was fundraising at the home of George Clooney, and he installed his art. And the title of the painting, which showed somebody mowing the lawn, somebody cleaning the inside of the house, cleaning the pool, was "We Are All Americans." Well, immediately the Secret Service took the installation down, and he wasn't sure if President Obama saw that. So I guess the question would be, yes, this would have impact.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that? The impact that this could very much have on the immigrant experience, or how immigrants are very much understood or viewed?
Right.
How
And
we
if
can
we're
shape policy in
if
the
we're looking
US?
for reciprocity, then that's for how I interpret that
Mhm.
world to mean, that there's something that we could reciprocate with
Mhm.
other peoples who have, if the U.S.,
Mhm.
United States of America has been a history of different migrations,
Mhm.
immigrations, then we should think about that.
Reciprocity,
Reciprocity.
solidarity.
These are
right.
terms that come
Mhm.
from political communities that think about this differently than, let's say, the great philosophers of the West.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure, I think I just taught Hegel the phenomenology of spirit, and Hegel talked about recognition, how the
Mhm.
self and the other need to be recognize each other.
Mhm.
Well, the indigenous are saying they would agree, but they would call it reciprocity.
Yes.
Franz Fanon argued the same thing in his work.
Mhm.
Césaire did the same thing. How can we achieve more reciprocity? And what would that even look like?
Mhm. Thoughts? Open the floor to thoughts, questions? Yes.
I'm in Professor Campos' class, but I'm focusing a lot about immigration and
Mhm.
immigration aspects. So we're talking a lot about transnationality and transamericanity, and we read Jose Marti's Our America, and we read it in a chapter in your book. And what stuck out to me is that it was, while it seems that Jose Marti was a very important social critic, I mean, the sentiment that he was getting about America is very critical, and it started making me think about how, like in terms of just the way that my family immigrated, it was always a very thankful to the host country that was like an asylum. And it's like, what's the ethical responsibility to both criticize and sort of support the host country?
Right, I think that's a great point. And you're reminding me of, as the things I've tried to think about now 12 years ago, and I haven't taught Marti recently, but I've been thinking about him for today's visits. Marti was an amazing poet, so he was writing poetry in New York City, which wasn't all critical. He was going to hear lectures by the great American writers of the 19th century in the city. He went to go see Ralph Waldo Emerson. He had a lot of sympathy and empathy of what Emerson was arguing about the United States. And his colleague, Thoreau, who was protesting U.S. policy as a poet and as a writer. He saw Herman Melville, the great writer of Moby Dick and other stories that critiqued U.S. slavery. So he was following, I think, in a tradition of our canonical American writers. So yes, I'm trying to mediate that Marti was joining a group of writers from the United States that he was seeing lecture and debate in New York City that helped him formulate his own critique coming from Latin America and Cuba. Remember, he had been imprisoned by the Spaniards. So yes, I think there is an ethical responsibility to acknowledge your host country as an immigrant or migrant, but the host country should recognize you as well and your struggles. That's all. That's what I'm getting at. And I guess the other thing I would say, when I was writing my first book and this one, I was an English major and a comparative literature major, but no one ever told me that Jose Marti wrote more essays in the United States and poetry than anyone except for Ralph Waldo Emerson. That if we really want to understand American literature and culture, we should read all of Marti's essays that he published in New York called Cenas Norteamericanas, North American Scenes. That would add to, I'm not just saying we should include, something through pluralism, but just to have a better understanding of how other writers supported each other. And in this case, Marti put himself with a long line of American writers who were critical of the host country called the United States. So I don't know, what are your feelings about that?
So for an artist, I guess that would be, for a writer and a poet, that would be an important thing.
Right.
But for immigrants in general, is that a sentiment that should be sort of like the idea that someone is living in a country, but the second they can, they'll go home.
Right.
Like that could make people uneasy.
Right.
So for an artist and someone who's a social critic, like that could be important, but for the general population, how would that be balanced?
Right.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah, sure.
So our time is almost up,
Okay,
so this
sure.
would be the last question. And if you could also wrap up your
okay.
thoughts. I think it's a very good
Right.
place to end today.
Right. Well, what I would have loved to have seen happen, and what I would love to see to continue to happen, is that the immigrants and migrants who are here today, in like New York City or in California, get the opportunity through an education to be able to read and understand a wider understanding of their place in the imagined community and in our practices of the nation. That would be a first step. So if immigrants today were given equal education and to become American in that sense, I think they would be able to engage better with their history in the United States, their culture, their formations, where they are, and then develop their own ideas, obviously, from that. Who knows if they would be as critical as Jose Marti. He was a poet, after all, and a cultural critic, but he was also the founder of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, right? He had many hats to wear. So that would be one answer. And again, I want to thank everybody for coming, for engaging with Americanity and Transamericanity. And I do have office hours on Friday, so I'd love to talk to if anybody wants to come and talk.
Yeah, and I think it is a revolutionary concept. But when you said you're not an activist scholar, but I do see it as a political identity, also as a praxis in terms of literary criticism as well.
Right.
So I thank you so much for giving us this time. Also, I would like to thank Rojo Institute, Roy, the professors who are here. Professor Robles, I think he left, and other faculty members who are here. Thank you for being here and for bringing your classes, and thank you all for being here as well. Right. Professor Saldivar has there are numerous events coming up, so please hold on to your calendars and make use of the professor.
Well, thank you very much for, yes.